Hello and welcome from Westminster Libraries. My name is Monica. I work at Paddington Library. We are delighted to welcome back Kate Macdonald for the fourth talk today. This talk will be on disability through fiction. Kate is a literary historian and the director of Handheld Press. And this afternoon, we're pleased to be joined by Professor Tom Shakespeare, sociologist and bioethicist. Is an academic who broadcasts regularly on BBC Radio 4 and is a fellow of the British Academy. Kate will be talking with Tom about disability in fiction and novels. Before we get going, just to let you know that the talk would be approximately 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Do feel free to send us at any point during the talk your questions and also suggestions of books where disability is central. The chat feature has been turned off, so please type all your comments in the Q&A. The moderators, Susie and Sarah, are here with me this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing your questions and recommendations. Well, that's all for me. I shall hand over to Kate and Tom.
Well, Tom, good to see you again.
Good to be here, thank you.
Yeah, so we in our preliminary chat about this, we had to stop talking because it was just too energetic. We were in danger of having the talk last week. So I think we should start by thinking about representation. So you've done a lot of writing about representation in different ways. Can you focus in a bit on representation of impairment and disability in fiction?
Yes, and I think that it's really good that over the last 20 or 30 years, disabled people have highlighted this area. Because if we want to know why people are perhaps prejudiced or have negative attitudes about disability, then one way to look is to look at the books we read or the cinema or TV that we watch. Just very simply, I think that there tends to be discussion of three major stereotypes. First of all is what you could call a tragic cripple, you know, a very negative, a tragic but brave character, and often that's highlighted with the figure of Tiny Tim in Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. Secondly, there's this idea of a sort of sinister villain character, and we know that the word sinister comes from the Latin for left-handed. So if you're left-handed, you're meant to be evil in classical representation. And if you think this is sort of, oh, wow, we're not classical anymore, just look at the new James Bond film. A lot of the James Bond villains have had some sort of deformity or disfigurement or difference. And even the latest, we've been here for years, but even the latest the James Bond film is like that. And there are many other representations. I mean, in the work of William Shakespeare, Richard III, you know, that's Tudor propaganda, fair enough. But, you know, Richard III was a hunchback. I don't think he necessarily was in real life. And a third image looks better. It's what we might call a supercrip. And it's the idea of somebody who's overcome their impairments or is an inspiration to us all. And that sounds really good, except sometimes it can be, as it were, over the top. And it's too positive. And what we're really asking for is a character in the main, a protagonist, or a background character where the disability does not define their whole nature, where they are an ordinary person, positive, negative, good, bad, and with all the richness of any other character, not just a sort of prop for the audience to project their sort of strange feelings and anxieties on.
Yep, I think that's all pretty sound. There is also an additional the function of a character in a novel, a narrative, in which a disabled character will function as a narrative prosthesis. They become a metaphor, they become an opportunity to signify something to the reader. So they don't actually have any personality of their own, they're just there in an allegorical sense.
Well, I think those three stereotypes really do that, because they're not really about real living, breathing disabled people. They're about our fears. They're about non-disabled's feelings.
It's about projecting. You're quite right. Yeah. And the character, the villains in James Bond are classic in their lazy writing, because it's just shorthand.
Yeah. You'd have thought they'd have changed, but they haven't changed.
Well, they've only just begun to make women have agency and to have a life outside being a Bond girl. So perhaps in about 30 years, they might have got around that with the villains as well. It's a bit yes, it's depressing and also wearisome, but things are beginning to change. I was reading Nicola Griffith's blog earlier, and she was saying in 20, 30 years, lesbian, gay, queer people have been writing about their lives, and things have changed in the West massively for the representation of lesbian, gay and queer people. So the same process ought to be happening for the depiction of disabled people if we can hear their stories.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think the key that Nicola is referring to there is that LGBT people are writing their own books. And I think that if you've lived it, if you've experienced it, if it's normal for you, then it's no longer something that you think is odd or weird or has to be explained.
Yeah, I think we should have a little talk about this book, So Lucky by Nicola, which is a book she wrote in a mad outpouring of passionate fury and rage because she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis about 25 years ago. And she has been practicing as a writer for about the same time, because before that she was a self-defense instructor. So she could when the MS started to really affect her physically, she could no longer earn her living in self-defense. And so writing became more important for her. And she wrote science fiction, she wrote lesbian noir, she wrote amazing novels, but didn't really tackle disability until about 3 or 4 years ago, when this novel, So Lucky, just poured out of her. And I know you've read it, and I know you think it might be a tiny bit compressed because it's such a skinny wee thing. I mean,
well, it's a novella, really. It's not a full-length novel, is it?
Yes, it's a long novella. It takes about 2 hours to read, depending on your speed of reading. But it is does a tremendous job, I think, of depicting the lived experience of what it's like to gradually become less and less able with her particular condition. Did it speak to you in a similar way? Did you recognize aspects in it?
Yes, of course. You know, I haven't got MS, unlike Nicola or the character in the book. But yes, I recognised a lot of it. And my only criticism, as I say, is that it is compressed. So lots of things happen to the central character within a very short period of time, and that's necessary for the book. I mean, it's not like War and Peace, you know. And we might get bored with it if it was. So it's very exciting. It's got, you know, she has symptoms of MS. She joins a disability network, and then there's a sort of a thriller plot which I won't divulge. But and of course in the background is her romance, whether, you know, who she's going to end up with and so forth. You know, I think there, of course, I recognise a lot of the points. And I mean, part of me was frustrated because she, for example, I've just been looking at it before our talk, and she turns up at the airport and she's surprised by the length of time she has to walk and all the rest of it. But I hope that most disabled people now know that if you book in advance, you tell them you're disabled, you rock up to the assistance desk, you get whatever it is, a jeep to get you to the destination or whatever. So I think that these are learning points. You know, they show us what it's like to encounter an airport and the rest of it. But in a way, and maybe because she's a newly disabled character, she's not familiar with it. But, you know, most of us who've been around, we are familiar with it. And it doesn't always work, and unfortunately we know it doesn't always work. And I'm quite interested in those points where, you know, everything is in place but it doesn't work. And so, for example, you know, they don't get you off the train or the tube when they're meant to, when you've told them you're coming. These are the bus ramp doesn't work. You know, so we're now at the stage, we've moved beyond the stage of no provision at all. We're now in a stage where we have provision, but we can't rely on it. And almost that's worse. Almost that's worse because, you know, you're taken aback. And my friend ended up, you know, somewhere in the home counties, and really she only wanted to go to King's Cross because she couldn't get off the tube.
Yeah, and that's where anger kicks in, because the systems are there, they're perfectly good, they've been well thought out in as far as they can be, and yet something goes wrong. So a character drives their car and parks it beside her car so she can't actually get out.
And this happens all the time. I mean, this is very, very real. This is, you know, and obviously people steal the handicap parking bays, as they would be in this book, the accessible parking bays and so forth. I think it's interesting because in the past, we had people defined by their incapacity, what they couldn't do. They couldn't walk, they couldn't speak, or whatever it might be. And now we have run the risk, I don't think that is in this book, but it could be, of people defined by the failures of by oppression, by discrimination, by the failures of provision. And what we've got to try and do is get a sense of agency. And I think Nicola does it in this book because, you know, the character, you know, she's a self-defense instructor, she's feisty, she's used to being listened to. And I think that aspect of making sure that, because as disabled people, we are all, almost all of us, you know, pretty full-on feisty sort of people, and we have to be. And so I think we have to try and preserve that in the fiction.
Absolutely. And there's also another aspect. It's not that disabled people are defined by their lack. They're now defined in a way by their needs, because they actively need and want X, Y, Z to be able to live their life in the way they want to, or the way they should to, which is, you know, they need the parking space, they need the ramp, they need the special Jeep at the airport. A different book that we were looking at, Vonda McIntyre's The Exile Waiting. This is science fiction, and it's a different kind of depiction of disability, because it wasn't until I'd read this novel several times, and it's a favorite from my decades and decades ago, that I realized that every single character has an impairment. And it doesn't matter who you look at. Sometimes it's an emotional one, but a lot of the time it's physical, or it's a twisted and peculiar way of looking at the world, which is brought about by the impairment of emotional blockage. And I think it was very brave of Vonda in the 1970s to have written a novel with so much upfront challenge to ableism without actually using the word ableism, because I guess it hadn't been invented then. What did you think of this novel?
I enjoyed it. I mean, I'm not, you know, I don't spend all my time reading science fiction, but I enjoyed it. You know, I thought it was very interesting. I think that, as I understand it, quite often in science fiction, as it were, disability has been eliminated, because in the future, you know, you'll be able to go on jetpacks and you'll be able to have transporters and all the rest of it. It's all technology, so there is no disability. And even if you have a different body, it's all solved. But what you get in this novel is the struggle, is the, I mean, not to I hope, spoil it for anybody, but some characters are deformed because of basically toxic waste that has deformed them. But it's good because it shows you something age old, which is that they're rejected, they're expelled from their society. And I think, in a way, it's a futuristic novel, but with an almost sort of Greek, you know, classical Greek past. And I like that. Yeah, it's got spaceships, but it's about human dynamics or the ways in which societies expel unwelcome people.
It is very recognizable. So many of the situations, although they're futuristic and post-nuclear holocaustistic, they are just people we might recognize those situations today. It is a remarkably well-lasting novel. It deserves to be better known, I think.
Yeah, it's very good. It's very good. Yeah,
Who else would you recommend for people to read to explore the experience of disability as written by people with impairments?
Well, I think, I mean, recently I've been reading Rosemary Sutcliffe. Many people remember The Eagle of the Ninth. But what they might not know is that Rosemary Sutcliffe herself was disabled. She had juvenile arthritis, and she spent, you know, all of her life with very, very significant disability. And then you look at some of the characters in it, and if you remember, a lot of the lead characters are disabled. They've had a wound. They've got a scar. They've got something that they've been damaged by. And I find that very interesting, that she lives it, but very quietly she writes it. But nobody will ever call her either a disabled author or somebody who specializes in disability. Another a writer that I like very much is Lissa Evans, and we've probably read her novels for, well, I mean, even in one of her novels for adults, sorry, what's it called? The first one's called Old Baggage, A Crooked Heart. The second one, there is a boy who's got a caliper on his leg. And he's just normalized, he's naturalized. So in her books for adults, but also her books for children, she's written her new book and one of her old books have got disabled characters, but they're not freaky. They're not sort of out to the side. They're very essential. And I like that in any author of children's books or in adult books who is able to just say, yeah, disability is part of life, deal with it. And I think that's very welcome.
Yeah. Do you know of any works in which people with Down syndrome are the characters or are depicted in any way?
I mean, there is not well, I'm sure there are many, but I don't recognize it. I mean, I have restricted growth, and there is a book called Stones from the River, which has got a character who has restricted growth. There are a lot of books, classic books like No Flowers for Algernon and The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, and all these sorts of books which have learning disabled characters in, not necessarily with Down syndrome, but they're often very stereotypical. They're written obviously by quite central authors, and there are these tropes of the sort of the gentle giant, or the person who doesn't know his own strength, or literally the dumb character, or whatever it might be. And of course you've got Forrest Gump, and you've also got Casey Chance in Being There, played by Peter Sellers in the film, I think. So there's obviously a fascination with intellectual disability. I'm not sure how many books are in public recognition that have got characters with Down syndrome, but we need more.
Yeah, or perhaps they've been so subtly written as to just evade the reader's recognition. I'm thinking about Robin Jenkins' The Cone Gatherers, which has a significant character with disability, but it's about 40 years since I last read it, but it's stuck in my head because I think the character as a villain is terrifying and impressive because of the way they get about, because I think they have to use some kind of stilts or crutches, and they move around in a tetrapodic way, which is at once alien but also extremely fast and efficient. It's, evolutionarily speaking, is a brilliant way to get about.
Well, yes, and in Wilkie Collins' book, The Law and the Lady, there's a disabled character who scuttles about very fast, I think.
I taught a class on disability and literature in which we looked at Little Dorrit, not Little Dorrit, no, it's the other one.
The Old Curiosity Shop?
The Old Curiosity Shop.
That's got a very unpleasant dwarfish character, yeah.
Yes, he is a terrifying character, but also he's a character who is the sharpest, the most intelligent, the most nimble-witted, and the most effective in how he manipulates and uses other people. I mean, the demonstration of power in that character is quite breathtaking. And then to have that side by side with a physical deformity as the Victorians saw it is such a massive statement by Dickens that these two must go together. The impact of that is quite horrifying.
Yeah, but then what's interesting is that Dickens, I think, both with disability and with Judaism, he produces a really horrible Jewish character in the character of Fagin. And then people write to him and they say, we don't like this is really horrible. And then he produces a much more positive Jewish character. And similarly, with Quilp, I'm pretty sure that after that, he produced a character who also had restricted growth, who was not so negative. So he did listen. And he was writing these fictions, and of course, there's Silas Wegg with the wooden leg, and there's Eugene Rayburn in his last novel. Sorry, I've lost it now. Obviously, that was one of the costs of Victorian London. You got a lot of disabled people. So, yeah.
In many, many ways, to lose mobility through disease, through illness, and as well as congenital stuff. It's a far unhealthy place to live.
But disability is part of life. So wherever you go, it's here. And I think that what we want is for fiction to show life. and and therefore it has to show disability, whether it's the older person or the child, or maybe somebody in working age, midlife.
Yeah. What you mentioned about earlier about the how science fiction can use a character who is disabled by basically taking away the disability through technology. Anne McCaffrey's 1967 story, The Ship Who Sang, which she developed into a very successful series of novels in the 70s and 80s, and I think into the 90s too. That is when she imagined what it would be like if you had babies who were born so unable to breathe for themselves, to move. All the physical faculties were very, very restricted or missing, but yet the mental faculties were there. The children would be encased in titanium tubes, and they would become ships. They would become the brain of the spaceship. So by exchanging their lack of mobility for permanent encasement, they would have the freedom of the galaxies, the freedom of the universe, and they would go off and have adventures. And they would
I'm not sure I take that swap, but I mean, you've also got in Star Trek Discovery, it is, isn't it, where you've got Data, and Data, I think, is blind, and he's got this sort of strange eyewear, but he's very, very good at understanding the universe. And indeed, Mr. Spock, you know, in a way, you know, he's a neurodiverse character, and yet he's extremely good. And of course, you've got X-Men.
Oh my goodness! Yeah,
all about disability. Yeah. And so we can't get away from it. But I think some of these characters are sort of sensational. They're meant to make us think, oh my goodness, you know. Well, I just want ordinary people, not too ordinary, because they've got to have dramas, otherwise it's not a book, but or not a film or not a TV show. But I want them to have so adapted and so normalized their way of being that, and maybe the character in Anne McCaffrey that you mentioned, maybe they've done that. I'm not sure.
I don't know. I don't think they've ever been filmed. I can only think of one normalized character in a narrative who happens to use a wheelchair, but that is utterly irrelevant for the plot, and that is the Hugh Grant character's sister in the sequel to Notting Hill. In fact, it may be Notting Hill. Yeah,
that's in Notting Hill, but also in Four Weddings and a Funeral, you have the brother who uses the sign language.
That's right, the deaf brother.
At a key point, I think Richard Curtis is pretty good on disability generally. So, and I'm not sure, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think he might have family members who are disabled. So, yeah, he's very quietly used these characters to say something quite normalizing about disability, which is really welcome.
It's terrific because it's using his power for good in a very, very strong way. Because,
and just I went to see, before obviously lockdown, I went to see the Royal Shakespeare Company at the Barbican in, I think, As You Like It. And one of the minor noble women of whatever court it was in the Forest of Arden or whatever it might be, used sign language. And her words that had been written by William Shakespeare, obviously, were voiced over by a sign language interpreter who was another, courtier. And so at the start,
so imaginative.
Well, at the start, I thought, oh, blooming hell, it's a gimmick, And then I thought, no, why not? There would have been just deaf people, and they and how would they be involved unless they had an interpreter? So it was just so included, and I think that's Shakespeare didn't write that woman as deaf. Of course he didn't. But there's no reason why they couldn't be. And it's a bit like the same with multiracial casting. Of course, David Copperfield is not meant to be Asian, but who cares? It doesn't make any difference. You just get used to it, and why not? And I think that there's been an explicit desire in terms of drama, particularly, to have multiracial casting. And I think we need that same approach in disability. And that includes in the books and the scripts and everything else that we read.
I mean, there are theatrical companies. There's a name I can never pronounce. It's
Grey Eye.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. So Grey Eye, which is a very well-known dramatic company who have actors of differing physical and mental impairments who are really well known. And I know that there is another one in Scotland, and that name has completely escaped me, but that might be some time ago. Anyway. But
there are a few. There are a few, and there's also Kanduko who make dance, and I think it's terrific. And I think that, for example, I went to see Grey Eye in Sarah Kane's Blasted, and they had disabled characters, disabled actors, deaf actors, and all the rest of it, and blind and all the rest of it integrated, and you were perfectly okay with it. You might have been a little bit freaked out to start with, but actually the play is the play, and it doesn't make any difference what the impairments have, really.
Yeah, and it's, as you say, it's normalizing is key. And on that subject, I'm interested in adverts, visual adverts, because it was very obvious to me from my teens onwards that when a particular look was in fashion, suddenly all the adverts were full of it, all the catalogues as they were then were full of it. So we had Hazel O'Connor in Breaking Glass with a very striking yellow bottle brush punkish haircut. And suddenly all the models have a yellow bottle brush punkish haircut. The same when Kate Middleton became very celebritified and married to Prince William. Suddenly all the models had long dark hair, whereas before they would have been blonde. I'm noticing now there are models in adverts for banking and for Google and for Amazon who are Down syndrome.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are actors around, and not just Down syndrome, but other impairments as well. And there are, there's models of diversity. There are models who are different shapes. And I think that the more we get used to that, the more we can say, well, to start with, it might be a bit confronting, but the more that we can see it, the more that we will accept it.
Yeah, and the role of Paralympian athletes who are used to running on the extraordinary prosthetic steel bendy lower legs, they're walking in fashion shows.
Yeah, that's right. Well,
and so on.
Well, but back in the day, Dazed and Confused did that photo shoot with Alexander McQueen. I think there is a danger with, I mean, I like the Paralympics, don't get me wrong. I think there is a danger that it's all about physical power, really, and not all disabled people are capable of that, or even want to do that. And I see on in the media people saying, well, you watch the Paralympics now, take some physical exercise. And I think that's all very well, but it's not possible for everybody.
No.
And if somebody is tetraplegic or has a muscle wasting disease or fatigue condition, they're not going to be able to do that. So I think we want to be a little bit careful about the balance of our representations.
Yeah, the glamorization is important, but also
glamour is good, but having a range of options, really, because we might choose different things, and we're like every other human being.
Yep, I agree. Yeah, we need to think that otherwise. We talked before about the Fries test. Kenny Fries invented this test in fiction because originally Alison Bechdel produced a test for feminism, in that if you can have a work of fiction of any kind, any media, in which two women are having a conversation that's not about a man and not about their love lives, then that's really good. It's passed the Bechdel test. And Kenny Fries invented a test which applied that template and mapped it onto disability. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we should say that Kenny Fries is a literary writer. He's a literary critic, and he's very good at what he does. And I think that Kenny Fries, the Fries test, as it's become called, is aimed at adult novels or other works of fiction. The idea is that there should be more than one disabled character. So I think he takes that from the Bechdel test. Their function should not be to, as it were, display heroism or to have a cure or to overcome their disability. Because a lot, as I've said at the start of this conversation, a lot of the prevailing narratives are about overcoming disability. And they're not going to die either, because remember, the tragic character, the evil character, they're often shot or they die. So and it's really a challenge to people. And I know that Nicola Griffith has written quite a lot about this, and has got a list of novels that may be familiar to many people on her website of books that conform to that. And I like it. It's a good initiative. He's right to critique existing literature. I wonder about, why does there have to be two? You know, because disabled people often have non-disabled friends, or probably almost always. We're not,
too.
yeah, we're not in a ghetto. And yes, sometimes we talk to other disabled people. Sometimes we talk to non-disabled people. I don't think that, I think he's taken that from the Bechdel test, because the whole thing about the Bechdel test was that women only talk to each other about men. And let's take men out of the picture and let's just have women being women. And I'm all for that. And I think it's great to support that. But I suppose I also write, and I would like a bit more freedom in how I write disabled characters, that I don't have to think, oh, I've got one, better have two, otherwise I won't pass the freeze test.
Yeah, it's true. And it's equated to trying to write in an anti-racist way. You would need two characters of color. And why would they want to talk to each other about matters to do with people of color? Why can't they talk about the price of fish? Or
That's true.
Yeah, when's that bus coming?
I think particularly, the whole thing about impairment is that we're not in families of other impaired people, or not usually. And we usually don't work with other people who have impairments. So we don't necessarily even socialize with other people who are disabled. We might do, that's our choice, but we don't have to. And so I think it's particularly strange for me that the only books which show that are okay. So anyway, I do think we should have that by all means, but we might want to have an awful lot of other things as well. But yeah, it's a good start, and it is a challenge to us. And then we realize how many of the representations are very stereotypical, or they're overcoming disability, or they're wonders of cure, medical cure, or whatever it might be. But I really hope that people are thinking in a bit more sophisticated way.
Yeah, there's another element to that which Nicola listed. She says, I don't want the characters to function as education or profit for a non-disabled character. So the character who is disabled is not there to educate the non-disabled. That can't be their prime focus. I'm almost certain that all disabled people along the way educate non-disabled people, because there's so much ignorance. And so I, as long as we're not too rigid about any of these rules, I don't think you can make fiction by rules. No, of course not. But there's also ramming it down people's throat. You can have so many teachable moments in a narrative that the reader will just think, oh, where's the story? I want the story back. Give me my adventure, my romance, my thrill.
I can give you an example of that. I'm an academic, so I review papers for journals. And somebody sent this paper about representations of disability. And basically they said this character must be very ordinary. They can't overcome their tragedy. They can't be a teachable moment. And by the time they'd finished, and it was in soap operas, I think, I thought, hang on a minute, soap opera is full of melodramatic character. This person's got to overcome something, because everybody in a soap opera overcomes something or is defeated by it. Otherwise, what you've produced here is very politically correct, but also very boring. And soap operas do not have boring characters.
Where is the challenge and where is the conflict? The story comes of conflict.
You have to have conflict. And the thing is about disability, it does present huge conflict. And the conflict may be me, restricted growth paralyzed person, putting on the duvet cover, or it may be somebody else's attitudes, or it may be poverty, or whatever else it might be. I think what Kenny is talking about, what Nicola is talking about, is that the conflict cannot always be overcoming disability, because most of us don't spend all our time doing that.
No, you live your life and you get on with what you're interested in.
Same with everybody else. I dropped something on the floor. Blooming heck, I've got to crawl on the floor and pick it all up. Life is full of strange and stupid things that happen to disabled people, and a lot of humor. Anybody who's lived life as a disabled person knows that it's very funny, because things go wrong and people are stupid and all sorts of things occur, and probably which wouldn't otherwise occur. At the end of the day, you have to embrace it.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Okay, I think we can now ask Monica. Has anyone put any suggestions or questions in the Q&A that we can start to consider?
I'm reading to the Q&A. One suggestion is of a French novel by Paul Féval called Le Bossu, the Hunchback, where the central character Dumas is a simple style hero. Melissa is asking this, whether you know of this novel.
No, I don't, I'm afraid. Yeah.
No, it does bring to mind the Hunchback of Notre Dame, though, which is probably the Disney cartoon is the first exposure a modern child might have to somebody who has a hunchback, and then that's going to set up all sorts of strange ideas. But no, I do not know the novel by Bossu, but yes, I should say that all the suggestions we get, we hope we're going to make them into a list so that Westminster Library can distribute them at will to anyone that wants them. Is there another one?
Not a suggestion, but I can start with the questions that they've asked us. And starting with Didier, can you recommend any advice, guide type books for those who devise characters for novels, film, TV and theatre scripts?
So this is advice for writers who want to include characters that are disabled in scripts, novels. Well, Tom.
Colin Barnes wrote an analysis of stereotypes for British Council of Disabled People many years ago, but I don't think there are, I think the question is learn more about disability. So take it as a moment to explore a bit more and think about those negative characteristics. There is a journal called the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. I mean, it might be a bit academic, but I think it's online. And they're coming up to their 50th issue. So they've been around for a while now, and they will describe all of the negative stereotypes. So just avoid those.
Yeah, and that journal is open access. It is extremely good. It's not particularly high level jargon. You're not going to get boggled if you're not from an academic background. So it's worth looking at that. I would also suggest going back to Nicola Griffith's blog, because she's got a very good long page saying never do this if you're going to be writing about disabled characters, la, 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 la. Always do this, la, 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 la. So there are positive and negative.
And I want to break all the rules immediately. I reserve the right to break the rules. And I think what she's saying is basically, you know, if you do it like this, unless you're really, really, really good, you're going to end up with a stereotype. And that's what we've got to avoid, is the stereotypes.
Yeah. And a stereotype is something that has no dimension other than it's there for what the author wants it to be there. There is nothing in that character for a reader to read things into a different way or to interpret a different way. So if you find that your characters are simply flat lumps on the page doing nothing, then you might need to think about giving them a bit more backstory or to approach their disability in a different way. I think there's a lot to explore there. Monica, let's have the next one. You're muted.
Apologies. Josie is a comment is loving the discussion so far, taking notes of books to read and authors to check out. Any specific fiction recommendation for children and young people, she's asking.
Children.
Well, as I say, I do think that Lissa Evans has written 2, which are very good. Yeah, I think the great thing about children's fiction is it is one of the most imaginative and inventive areas, and also with the emphasis on showing lots of different images. I think there will be others. I haven't got a list of them, and I'm sorry.
I would think that a children's librarian would really know their stuff. I would recommend going to the library and asking, what have you got? And if they don't have anything,
tell them to get them. Tell them to
get them.
And
then get them to do the research for you, because librarians are the best people to find out a kind of book on a certain theme or a certain subject. So go to your library. That's it. That's the advice.
Then Melissa again mentions the brilliant performance by companies like the Chicken Shed. They're specialized in children's, actually, children's play. Yes.
They're a company of people with intellectual disabilities, or at least they have people with intellectual disability in their work.
No, I've not. No, I lived abroad for a long time, so when my children were small, we've had very little exposure to anything other than the mainstream, which is a bit of a shame. But Monica.
Next is Sarah, I'm curious about your thoughts on mental illness disability in fiction. I can think of lots of villains and tragic characters, but what about other positive, neutral representations?
So this would be intellectual disability, because that's quite separate from mental illness, which is...
No, I think she's talking about mental illness.
Really?
She specified mental illness. And I mean, yeah, and the thing about mental illness is, of course, lots and lots of writers have had mental illness, from Virginia Woolf and so on. And they've in turn portrayed various characters with mental illness. I'm thinking here, though, of Kay Redfield Jamieson, who wrote a book, is it called Touched by Fire, which is basically about how bipolar can be both a source of creativity as well as a source of depressive illness. Yeah, I think that's quite controversial book, but it's quite interesting because it shows that that there's great positivity as well as some negativity about some of people's lives. And I remember working with this artist, Aidan Shingler, who himself had schizophrenia, and he would make wonderful artworks. His exhibition is called Beyond Reason. So I do think there's much scope. I'm not sure whether we've quite achieved the potential.
Thank you. Next is Joe asking, you mentioned how disabled characters in fiction are often endowed with enhanced or unique skills or qualities. Do you think this is a positive depiction, or is there a risk of being used as a plot device at the expense of realism?
I think it depends on the genre. If it's science fiction, yes, you're there as a plot device and there is no realism, because that's your special skill has been evolved from a disability. But if it's not science fiction, then no.
Well, I mean, yeah, I'm just thinking of the film Rain Man, and you know, the character there with autism, and he had great mathematical ability. And of course, some people with autism do have savant skills, but most people don't. And the danger is that you're always looking for that particular ability in a very ordinary person. And again, it becomes a stereotype, and it almost lets us off the hook, because it's, okay, they have something wrong with them, but they have something right too. They have this compensatory ability. And you even have this trope of, what's it called? People, sorry, I've forgotten what it is. People with other abilities, basically. And you think, well, no, some people just lack, and that's fine. They're still okay.
Yep. I've just remembered a
differently
brilliant
able.
novel.
That's it. Differently
able.
I
yes.
don't like that.
I've just remembered a really, really good novel, which I think is sort of YA, early young adult, Speed of Dark by Elizabeth Moon. She is usually shelved in science fiction, but this novel is not science fiction, and it's based on, well, it's about a young man with autism who finds work, and there is a dramatic plot, and his colleagues who all have autism have to work together to try and find a way and resolve the situation. And there are very few characters who do not have autism. I think it's a remarkable novel, but it may be found in the science fiction shelves if you're looking in Waterstones.
That sounds great. I was a bit sad not to find on Nicola's list, and I know why, because it doesn't quite fit the rules. Maybe the Moon, which is a book by Armistead Maupin about a woman with restricted growth who's an actor in costume. You know, she wears you know, like in E.T. or
I had no idea. Yes, I know about his work.
It's a lovely book, and I don't know any people with restricted growth who don't like it. So I think it's a good representation.
That's really good. I should go and get that one. I like his writing very much, and I assumed that title was yet another of his no,
it's not. Novels. It's not. It's very good.
Good, thank you. Monica.
Tina is asking, actually, she's mentioning a book, which is Arts and Wonders, saying it's one of her favorites. I checked this by an author called Gregory Normanton.
Gregory Normanton, Arts and Wonders, do you know it?
Yeah, I know Gregory, and I think it's a great book, and he's a great writer. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I need to read it, obviously.
He's a sort of modern British novelist. He's very good. He's probably written at least half a dozen novels by now.
Okay.
And there's quite a few. There's quite a sort of genre of novels about restricted growth people. And what was interesting, I became friends with Sarah Tennant because she wrote a book called The Courtesan's Dwarf, which was set in the 17th century. And she really wanted to make the character more normal. And so she talked to me about what it was like to have a restricted growth. And I obviously tried to educate her, and she wrote a much better representation as a result. I think a good author will go and do that research and find out so that they can portray it more accurately.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it's research and it's an experience they don't have, so they have to go find out.
It's like all the aspects of research. I'm trying to put a physicist in my book at the moment, and I never studied physics, and I've interviewed lots of physicists, and it's very interesting, their lives, and so that I can make my physicists more genuine.
Good. Monica.
Margaret writes, I'm thinking of the 19th century local guidebooks where the writer asks visitors to view the impressive scenery, town hall and local imbecile.
Well, I wouldn't approve of that. and I know that some people don't like the word idiot or the accusation idiot, because of course, there was this idea of the village idiot, in inverted commas. So, imbecile would be a word that there was idiots, imbeciles and morons. It was a classification in a very eugenic, IQ-based idea about, classifying men and women. So, it's very much a thing of the past. So let's leave it in the 19th century.
Another couple of recommendations. So one is The Underdogs by Chris Bonello. And Richard Gibson is recommending H.G. Wells, The Country of the Blind, and he thinks it's great.
Yeah, The Country of the Blind is amazing. It's a really powerful story. Have you read it, Tom?
No, I haven't. I'm going to have to go off and read it.
Yeah, it's not very long. It's a character is in a country where everybody is blind, and he is the only person that can see. And it is an astonishing amount of Wells' imagination, of course, but yes, it's not sensational or beyond the bounds of imagination in the slightest. It is a phenomenal work.
So a bit like Jose Scaramaggo, who wrote that famous book about blindness. Yeah,
I haven't read that one. I've tried to read it.
It's a modern book. It's all about everybody having an epidemic of blindness. Yeah.
Well, I suppose the day of the Triffids, John Wyndham. When the Triffids come, and anyone who sees the shower of meteors that come down, they are struck blind. And then you have a world populated by mostly people without sight, except for the few who were stoned or drunk at the time of the meteor shower, so they were asleep and didn't get affected.
Oh.
But science fiction, again, it takes an idea and extrapolates.
And I haven't written any science fiction, but I'm fairly sure that writers sit there and they think, what can I imagine? Let me imagine the most extreme thing. What would happen then? And I think that's why it's so good. But it's also, why it's sometimes rather fanciful. It
can be too challenging, and it can be, too difficult for people to take on. It's true. But science fiction is what if, and then let's go and take a walk with this what if.
And I think the challenge is for science fiction, you gave us that great book by Vonda McIntyre that's from the 1970s, isn't it?
That's 75, yeah.
I mean, would you say that science fiction today was using that creative possibility? Because we don't want just stereotypes. We want to say, actually, it could be different. Can we imagine a different sort of world where disability hasn't gone away, but doesn't matter as much? Are there books that do that?
There should be, and I haven't read enough to be able to give you a definitive answer. I'm thinking immediately about Becky Chambers, who has written about 5 or 6 novels now, which actively embrace and explore the idea of other bodies, other ways of living and other ways of being in a very positive way. And it is probable that in Becky Chambers' fiction, there will be characters who are differently abled, other-bodied, and it doesn't actually matter because that's not what the plot's about. The plot's about something completely separate. And so the difference is just background. But other people might be able to suggest others. Monica, what else is there?
A few more questions still. There is Joe asking, do you think it's easier to break the rules as a writer with disability?
Probably, in the sense, and I'm not saying that you're always right either, but I think probably because you are more familiar with it. and you know that life is complicated, and you're not so hung up on rules, perhaps. But but also writers with disabilities sometimes get it wrong, and they need to be called out. We need to be called out when we do. So obviously, my experience, for example, is not everybody's experience, and there's a danger if I mistake my reality for everybody else. So I probably still have to do some research. Every disabled writer has to do research as well, just to check, are they, they are producing something very imaginative, but does it match anybody ever? Could it be real? Could it happen? Or is it just them going off on one?
And then you find that the thing you've got wrong is actually the critical thing on which the plot turns. And without that...
I'm really worried about that, and I won't go into the details. Not to do with disability, but I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, when the agent reads this, she's going to say, "Have you checked this out with anybody?" Yeah.
Monica, what's the next one?
Catherine is suggesting The Last Custodian by Stephen Lightbow, and says that a recent collection of poetry about the last person on earth in a wheelchair. And she's also adding that I wrote my dissertation on disability in literature and film, and I'm currently working on a novel with many disabled characters. So hopefully she'll be on the list someday.
Well,
absolutely.
That would be good to hear about. Poetry. We haven't considered poetry, disability in poetry.
Yes, and I've just got a volume of poetry. I've just got a volume of poetry through the post, which I'm really excited to read. And I'm kicking myself because I haven't got it here. And I don't want to turn on my phone to get his name off Twitter. But there is more and more poetry because, of course, poetry is very accessible. Whether it's haiku is obviously most accessible, but lots of disabled people write really wonderful poetry.
I wish I knew more about the field, but I'm kicking myself for not bringing that in earlier. Thank you for that reminder that poetry exists. And
there are also lots of poets with mental health conditions like Ivor Gurney and all sorts of others.
Yeah. Monica.
And Didier is mentioning of the book, which is Writing Diverse Characters for Fiction, TV or Film, an essential guide for authors and script writers by Lucy B. Hay. So that was referring to the question we had earlier on. Yeah,
writing diverse characters. That sounds good.
Thank you, Didier. That's really helpful that you solved the question. Yeah, Lucy Hay is the author there.
Yeah, that will be on the list, I hope, Monica, when you compile it. Yeah.
Oh, we're keeping all of this, definitely.
Great.
Next is Melissa. So interesting about Rosemary Sutcliffe's arthritis, considering the number of authors with condition that they don't necessarily reflect in their work, from R.L. Stevenson to Gene Roddenberry, Star Trek. Lung conditions, she mentions. And
it is very interesting, and I would just recommend a book by Rosemary Sutcliffe. It's a memoir called
Blue Remember Tales.
That's right, and she talks very much about what the impact was on her family of her being disabled.
It is a remarkable memoir of growing up as a child with this impairment. But when I read it, I was struggling to work out what exactly she had. I find it almost too reticent in a way.
Right. And her mother had a bipolar condition as well. So she herself, so there's this sort of tension involved there as well. And also when you're writing about your family, you want to be careful not to actually, most people want to be careful not to paint them in too negative a picture.
And there is, and then the people she fell in, these men who she was falling in love with. Oh no, Rosemary! Oh gosh, no, what are you doing to yourself? Yes, it's quite an agonizing memoir written by the sunniest, most equable personality.
Well, she had a tough life, but there's also joy there as well, and about her writing and so forth. Yeah,
it is a fabulous memoir, Blue Remembered Hills by Rosemary Sutcliffe. I wonder if it's still in print, and I wonder if
I bought a copy of it recently. It's been republished by Slightly Foxed Books.
It would be excellent. Good. I've got a really chatty old one, but I'm pleased it's back in print. It's very, very good. Monica.
Babs is writing, like Nicola, I turned to writing when I got diagnosed with MS. I now find myself reflecting on childhood books like The Secret Garden and Hiding,
Yeah.
and wondering what disabilities Colin and Clara had, and it's never made clear. Do
No.
you think the characters in these books give children who read them nowadays a chance to empathize with disability?
I think they can be rather negative because, you know, the characters have to be cured before the end of it, and, you know, and their wheelchairs taken away, and then they can really walk. And I think this is problematic, a lot of these books. So I hope that people read them with an understanding that this might not be how life is like. They may be good books, but this is not how life is like for disabled children or adults.
When I read The Secret Garden, I never believed for a moment that Colin was truly disabled, because he's such a spoiled character. He was clearly putting it on, and he'd been led to believe, and he wanted to manipulate the people around him. And then he decided, actually, I can do this, and I want to, and I'm going to stop being so negative and dark, and I'm going to try and be active and have more fun. It was much more of a psychiatric condition, possibly. Not being an expert in the slightest, but I never thought he was physically disabled at all. And I haven't read Heidi since I was about 10, so I cannot remember what Clara's condition was, whether she was in a wheelchair. I mean, half of that novel is spent up a mountain, so I don't quite know how Clara would have coped.
There's a very good book by Lois McKeith called Take Up Thy Bed and Walk, which is all about stereotypes of disability in children's fiction.
That's interesting. Yeah, that sounds like one that should be read. Monica.
A couple more suggestions. One from Jen, which mentions Carl by Tanby Bush, a satire fiction in response to austerity. And then Sarah mentions Peanut Butter Falcon in a recent movie with the main character with Down syndrome. And it's fantastic, in my opinion, stepmother of an adult with an intellectual disability.
I have not heard of either, but they sound good stuff.
There's also a film with disabled characters called Sanctuary by Len Collin, which is very good, an Irish film. And there's I've forgotten the name of it. There's another really good film with a character with Down syndrome in it. It'll come back to me. Move on. Yeah.
Move on. Right. 2 a.m, it'll come back to you. Monica.
Sebastião is asking, any recommendations of books for the evolution of different disability stereotypes in films?
In films?
Yes, there's a book. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
No. You're the expert on this, not me.
There's a book by called The Culture of the Cinema of Isolation, and it's by a guy called, I'm going to call him Marty. I think it's Marty Norden, but it's definitely called the Cinema of Isolation, and it's all about stereotypes of disability in film. And there's another one which I've forgotten the title of, which is all about deaf people in film. Yeah, Martin Norden, Cinema of Isolation.
Good. I used to know, I did a lot of research on disability in First World War fiction, like fiction written during the First World War. And I've completely forgotten all my references, but I can pull them up and I can send them to you, Monica. So you can have a slightly academic section there on depictions in fiction and how these things emerged. But I cannot bring anything to mind right now.
We'll put them on the list, and I'm going to send the list. I'm going to send the name of this film with the person with Down syndrome in it.
It's going to be an epic PDF.
It's just on the end of my tongue.
Okay. Monica, what else
lastly, by Melissa, comment, love the Maupin, brilliant, used to publish in installments like Dickens. In fact, I've had an idea that Central Lady was based on a cameo character in David Copperfield, a divinely flirty manicurist. Miriam Margolis in Dickens' Women said that character was based on a real person who took exception to being portrayed as so coquettish. So Dickens toned her down on her next appearance so as not to offend.
Oh. A responsive author, very reliable.
Well, if you publish in installments, then you have to take account of your your customers to get
You
it right.
certainly do, and you have that freedom to do it. I was very practical.
My Feral Heart. That's the book. That's the film with a character in with Down syndrome in it, an actor with Down syndrome.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, that's been terrific. Have we reached the end of the questions? And
We
comments?
have. We made it just
Right.
in time with 1 minute over.
I'm delightful. Good.
Thank
That's
you
great.
so much, Kate and Tom. That was brilliant, fascinating. And please do send all the list over of books that we met. We've definitely noted these ones down. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just want to remind everyone that shortly we will be sending an email with a link to a feedback form. And we're always grateful for your feedback. It's just so nice to be able to pass on your comments to our speakers. And there will also be another email. I know, Didier, you were asking that I will be sending out in the next few days with a link to the recording of this event. And also, lastly, don't forget to check the Westminster Libraries website and sign up to the newsletters to find out more about all our events. For now, thank you all. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Tom, for joining us this afternoon. Thank you also, Susie and Sarah, and thank you very much from me. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.